Hi, I'm Paul Duchesne. Welcome to Mama Paul's video podcast. Today is Friday. It's still Friday, July the 30th, 2021. I'm going to sort of do a little bit of a follow-up to the last show. And the last show we talked about the current news from this last week, including the newspaper from today and a few stories from the previous days. But the main story that I talked about was the infrastructure bill and how the infrastructure bill had been whittled down to at least a fifth of what it started at, but it's actually even more than a fifth of what it started as. But I'm going to follow that up with a really interesting story that I ran into early this morning. Thom Hartman. I don't know how many of you listen to Thom Hartman. He's got a daily show. He used to be on Air America, which doesn't exist anymore. And he has his own podcast. My wife has a subscription to the podcast. So I hear pieces of Thom Hartman on a regular basis. And I get his newsletter downloaded. And it's usually a rant that he does about every day. He's really well informed, really smart guy. And he's very interesting to listen to, and he's totally on top of the news, and he's totally on top of some really big stories. He does a 3-hour show every day. I don't know how the guy does it. But anyway, I got a copy of the newsletter, and the newsletter starts off with a reference to the infrastructure bill. Democrats thought they could come up with a solution to the crisis of climate change, one that would also create millions of jobs, good-paying jobs, and revive the American middle class after the shocks of COVID. It was all in the $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill. And then came the recent headline. Kristen Sinema just threw an unexpected wrench into Biden's infrastructure plan. I do not support a bill that costs $3.5 trillion, says the Democratic senator. She, like Joe Manchin, is apparently at least partly in the employ of, Thom would say she's in the employ of the oligarchs, or like Paul Ryan, hoping to catch a great paying gig when the voters kick her out next time. She might be lobbying for a lobbying job, which is what this whole thing might be all about. What Thom's talking about here, the biggest crisis in America and the world is facing, is that the oligarchs are taking charge of one country after another. And this has been referred to as the fourth turning. The fourth turning. Now, this is a book that apparently came out back in the late 90s. I was not the least bit familiar with this book. And in the book, it's really interesting. How many of you have read Arnold Toynbee? Arnold Toynbee was a major historian, and he wrote about historical trends quite a bit. And when the last man who remembered the horrors of the last great war dies, the next great war becomes inevitable. When the last man or woman who remembers the horrors of the last great war dies, the next great war becomes inevitable. And it said it takes about 80 to 90 years to forget the lessons of the previous experiment. So what they're basically saying is about 4 generations, a generation being a 20-year period. So after a 20-year period, that holds all these people that remembered anything from that period are all gone, and that's when you get a repetition of the worst things that were going on then. Excuse me. So there's been three turnings so far, and we are approaching what he's calling the fourth turning. The first one would have been 12 generations ago. 4 times 3. 12 generations. 12 twos. 12 times 20 years. 240 years ago. 1776. The American Revolution. And the American Revolution happens when, and this was interesting that Thom pointed this out in his newsletter, it's when the British East India Trading Company collaborates with the monarchy or the oligarchs in order to attempt to stop the American Revolution. Well, I've been on the verge of doing one of my little history shows talking about capitalism and slavery, and I was going to go back to the British East India Trading Company. But that's really where the roots of the whole problem are. They go back to 1600, not 1750. So we'll do that on another show maybe next week, but part of it is happening right here, right now. So 1776, 240 years ago, there's a collaboration by the oligarchs to attempt to stop the American Revolution. 4 generations later, these oligarchs are making a fortune off the slaves that are picking cotton and tobacco and sugar in the South and all over the planet, not just in the South, all over the planet. And they attempt to fund the Confederacy and try to stop the freeing of the slaves that took place, and they basically were on the wrong side of the Civil War. The next great turning happens in the 1930s. We have the Great Dust Bowl, a huge climactic situation where literally hundreds of thousands of acres are parched, the wind is blowing, the dust is blowing. There was even dust reaching the east coast of the United States during this period of time, which I was not familiar with. So that's going on. The Great Depression is happening, so the Depression and the climate change were happening simultaneously. So the Great Depression happens, you've got what? Almost a third of the population, I think, is out of work. Yeah, almost a third of the population is out of work during the Great Depression. Things are really bad. Roosevelt comes in, and he wants to sort of undo Herbert Hoover's machinations, which were in many cases responsible for the overextended stock market and the crashing of the economy. So he starts to talk about Social Security and unemployment, and he's basically going to pump all this money into the economy to save the economy. This is the right way to do this thing. You put money, you give money to working people who then spend the money, and that's how the economy grows. When you give money to the wealthy people, the economy doesn't grow. Their economy grows. So anyway, Roosevelt, he comes from a really wealthy family. They're literally the aristocrats, but much like the Kennedys, Roosevelt's had a real social conscience about them, in spite of the fact that they were that wealthy and these major aristocrats of New York's political and social life. So Roosevelt is out there trying to maneuver things around to get the country on its feet, and a whole group of businessmen don't like what he's doing. They do not like what he's doing. I have never heard of this thing before. Let me put it up here on the side just for a quick second. Run your buck over here to the other and there. The Business Coup of 1934. The Business Coup of 1934. Holy mackerel. Never heard of it. It wasn't in my history book. I suspect it's in a People's History of the United States, which I ought to look at and find out whether it is. The Business Coup of 1934. What's going on is this guy, General Butler, he gets approached by a group of wealthy businessmen, and they offer him $30 million and 500,000 troops. $30 million and 500,000 troops. He wants them to lead a coup against Roosevelt and remove him from office. Possibly even execute him. They literally want him out of office. They liked Hoover in there. He was much better for them. Herbert Hoover was much better for the wealthy. And the fact that the market crashed didn't matter at this point in time. So they wanted to get this guy. So what he did was, he went along with them in order to basically subvert the whole thing. So he said, yeah, sure, I'll go along with this. And he goes along with this in order to tease out the plot and find out exactly where they're going with this. And what they were trying to do, their intention was to install a fascist regime like the one in Nazi Germany and Italy at the same time. In its final report, so we wound up in front of a Senate committee, and it was the McCormick-Dickinson Committee. And at the end of the day, after investigating this whole thing, they find out that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country and might have been placed in execution, and if the financial backers deemed it expedient, they were going to whack the president. They were going to kill him. So this all came out in the Senate hearing. Having said that, the people had deep ties into a mainstream media group. And what happened was they wound up turning against Butler. So the guy that brought the truth out, the media turned against him. He lost some of his credibility. And Roosevelt, in spite of the fact that he was the guy that was a target, he didn't take any, he basically cut a deal with these guys and let them off the hook, didn't pursue it any further. You leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. And that's where it was left. Now, some of the names of the people that were involved in this coup include U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, General Motors, Goodyear, Prescott Bush, the DuPont family, William Hearst, the Heinz family. You have Hutton, the Hutton family, Andrew Mellon, Moffett, J.P. Morgan, the Rockefeller Associates, Goodyear Tire, Chase National Bank. This is a who's who of who's in charge. The Business Coup of 1934. I'm going to look into this and find out whether this is actually mentioned in the People's History of the United States. As they end the story by saying, in times of great crisis, it's also a time of great opportunity. And I believe it's not the I Ching, but Lao Tse too, I believe, has a statement to this effect. And in times of great crisis, it is also a time of great opportunity. So the impact of this was that there were fascists back in the 30s attempting to overthrow the government of the United States here. Now, when we look at the history of fascism in America here, I've shown you pictures of Donald Trump's mom and dad with their Ku Klux Klan outfits on. I've shown you a picture of Fred Trump on his way to a fascist rally in Manhattan in 1939. In post-World War II, 1945 to 50, when the CIA was being formed by the Dulles, by Allen Dulles, Secretary of State, and John Foster Dulles. When the CIA was getting put into place, they were drawing a lot of fascists out of Germany and installing them in the intelligence community in America here. There was a letter to the editor. A few days, this was Wednesday's letter to the editor. They are fascist is the name of the little edit to the editor. For years, the Republicans have dominated the semantics game by labeling Democrats as socialists whenever they pass or seek to pass any progressive legislation from the New Deal, going back to the New Deal, up to the Affordable Care Act and beyond that. So anytime progressive Democrats trying to do something that's going to benefit the majority of the people in the country, they get labeled as socialist or even communist. They've also been labeled as communist, particularly during the McCarthy era. Remember it really well, the whole McCarthy era, when Joe McCarthy was on TV every other day calling everybody a communist and waving his piece of paper around. I have the names of these communists here. What a bunch of BS. The time has arrived when Democrats need to stop playing nice and label Trump Republicans for what they truly are. They are neo-fascist. They are not traditional conservative Republicans. They are true fascists. They are fascist. Nazism, N-A-Z-I, Nazi is the National Socialist the National Socialist Party of Germany. National Socialism. Nazism is National Socialism. Sounds like it's socialism. It's not socialism. National Socialism is what we've got here today. It's the socialism for the corporation, not for the guy working in the company. That's what National Socialism is. They believe in a strong man, whether he's right or wrong. The big lie about an election fraud. 3, they believe in white supremacy, preferably male-dominated white supremacy. 4th, they believe in armed insurrection if they don't get what they want. 5, that the limits on free speech and assembly by their opponents is severely limited. A police state where the police can do no wrong. Number 7, unlimited access to guns. Number 8, financial control for, of, and on behalf of the 1%ers, the oligarchs whose only interest is fattening their own wallets. If this isn't fascism, what is it? Letter to the editor, New York Times, Wednesday, the 28th. And that's what I mean about the Times, is you wind up getting frequently both sides of the story will get in the paper. A little quote from Upton Sinclair back in the 1920s. When fascism comes to America, it'll be wrapped in a flag and carrying a cross. It'll be wrapped in a flag and carrying a cross. And we can go back to the George Bush era, where we had literally at one point, in fact, I wrote a lengthy piece about it called Democracy, Christianity, and Insanity. We have a picture, my sister sent me a picture of Jesus Christ on a Humvee with an American flag wrapped around him and an AK-47 in his hand. An AK-47 and an American flag and Jesus Christ on a Jeep running through the desert. I mean, if this isn't insanity, what is? Democracy, Christianity, and insanity. So I just wanted to do this little thing about, we'll show it one more time, The Fourth Turning, goes back to the 90s. A really interesting book analyzing Arnold Toynbee's concepts of history. Next to it is a little bit slightly different book, and this is David Korten, The Great Turning. So it's another turning book, and that's the only reason I sort of dragged it out. And this is David Korten is the husband of the woman who publishes the Yes, a magazine, a positive journal. And he has quite a few books out, including When Corporations Ruled the World. And what this book is about is it's talking about how things are, the whole climate crisis and the economic failures and the demise of democracy are leading to a whole collapse of our civilization and culture. And now is this great opportunity that we have to do something different. When we were coming out of the pandemic, a lot of people thought that things were going to change radically, and then suddenly everything was just sort of going back to normal. And as it went back to normal, whoops, we're getting hit with the fact that there's another Delta variant out there. Maybe things aren't so normal. Who knows? So we still have a lot of time for this. We don't have a lot of time for the climate crisis, but we have time to get ourselves together, for us to get our act together and to do something about what's going on. If you remember when I started this whole thing about a year ago, I quoted, this was from the New York, this was in the New York Times in fact it was a year ago last July, and it was by Eric Whitney. I did a couple of shows about this. Feeling hopeless, embrace it. I see the world differently, now I have a sense of joy and purpose. This was Eric Whitney from Whitney Reader telling us to go and finish what we started. And by the we, I mean my generation. You people out there that are part of my generation, out there, we sort of left an unfinished litany of political, civic, and economic things that need to be accomplished. We just left them there. As the 70s ended and the political and spiritual divide sort of happened between the 60s revolutionaries who were starting to get a little bit spiritual, as sort of exemplified by the Beatles and their infatuation with the Maharishi. The political and the spiritual sort of came together for a brief period right around the Woodstock year, around 69. By the 70s, 72, 73, 74, that started to spin apart, and the spiritual seekers were going in one direction, the political people in another direction. And then during the 80s, there was sort of a debate going on about these two aspects coming together. And this is sort of what Eric Whitney was talking about, how after the 60s, we had all these high ideals, but we left a lot of them in the dust. We literally got commercialized. The commercialization of the whole movement. one week bell bottoms and flowers are an oddity and long hair, and the next minute, there's a play on Broadway, and everybody's got bell bottoms and long hair, and before you know it, hair becomes a Broadway play, and then they make a movie out of it, and before you know it, what used to be revolutionary music is now being played by Mantovani, and it's in an elevator. So the commercialization of things happens quite frequently, and it's easy to do in this society that we live in. All right, I think we studied it. We did it for the day. Let me get one more thing if Stephen is listening. One of my subscribers out there, Stephen, has asked me to do a story about a Stephen Donziger. And Stephen Donziger, who I downloaded this from the Wikipedia a couple of days ago. So I have here Stephen Donziger and Chevron. It's in my to be read pile. Well, he asked me, he said, well, why don't you find out and let me know what you think about this? Well, I didn't know who the heck the guy was even. I cannot keep up with everything. The next day, after Stephen sends me this, what do I get? This was in the Tuesday, July 27th paper. And lawyer who fought Chevron is found guilty of contempt. So this is this lawyer who's been involved with the case against Chevron that's been going on in, and this has got to do with the Ecuadorian Chevron polluting this large area in I believe Ecuador, and this was the lawyer who was representing them and gets a settlement. Anyway, they keep charging this guy with contempt of court, and they keep trying to put this guy in jail. So anyway, that's all I've got so far. I've got that I don't know what it's all about. I've got that I need to find out a little bit more about it. I will do a little bit of research. And Steve, if you've got something out there that you want to send me on this, feel free. If you want to give me a summary of the situation, I'll be glad to look at it. I'll finish up. Well, we'll go for the whole half hour. The other topic I had on the side here was surveillance. Remember a few days ago I did this story about the Pegasus project. And this is where this software was developed in Israel, which is being sold to quite a few countries, which seems to enable the software holders to get into your phone behind your passwords. Everything you've got is then available to them. And we're talking 180 journalists, editors, and mostly this stuff has been used to target political opposition. It hasn't gone after terrorists, it's gone after climate activists. It hasn't gone after people who are trying to save the planet. It's going after the people who are trying to save the planet, not the people who are causing it. I thought the story was going to die. It didn't die. It actually made it to an NPR story yesterday, and I thought it would have been in the Times today. It wasn't. I will look to see if there's a follow-up story in the Times over the weekend. It's a big story. There's hundreds of political leaders, journalists, people that are working for human rights around the planet. All of these kinds of people have been targeted. I have another story that I will look into more as we go along. And last but not least, we'll end on maybe a slightly positive note. Mindfulness. I have another page here. Mindfulness. And I just wrote that to cover up my paperwork. And this here is an article that was in the local independent journal paper last week. The downside of mindfulness. Some Americans can become more selfish and less generous. I'm not sure about the generous part. The more selfish part I can understand. Anyway, I have not finished reading this yet. I just started reading it. But I have a pile about this high about mindfulness, articles in newspapers, magazines. There is more misinformation about mindfulness than any other topic. It's unbelievable the interpretations of mindfulness that you find day by day. This was in the paper on what did I say, Tuesday? No, Monday. The next day in the New York Times, they always have this little page 3, bottom of page 3, they have this here to help little page. And I noticed 2 years ago there were 2 or 3 mindfulness things were in the paper quite regularly. And in fact, a lot of the mindfulness stuff goes back quite a few years. But anyway, here to help. 3 meditations for relaxing your mind this summer. And they're basically, when it's hot out, notice the sun and notice the sweat. At the beach, try to open up all your senses. On vacation, go without a checklist. When things don't go out as planned, put your phone and computer away, come back to your breath and notice how you're feeling. So the whole thing about mindfulness is being mindful of what's going on inside you. Now, you can be mindful of the world all around you out there. I try to be all the time. But the real mindfulness comes in being aware of what's your breath like? Is your breath steady, or is it getting erratic? Are you feeling tight, or are you feeling relaxed? How are you feeling? How you feel determines how you react. And you cannot react and act once you know how you're feeling. So in other words, you push me and I notice my breath. As you push me, my breath increases and gets sort of erratic, and I feel a little hurt there. Now, if I don't pay attention to what happened and you push me, I just push you back. If you push me and I pay attention to what happened inside, then I pay attention to my breath, I pay attention to my sensation inside me, and then I act. I put a buffer between myself and the action. I wind up acting instead of reacting. And that's the whole do good, avoid evil, purify your mind. That's the mindfulness in a nutshell. And I'm going to leave it right there. Mindfulness in a nutshell. Do good, avoid evil, purify your mind. The way you purify your mind is becoming aware of what you're feeling inside with your eyes closed, how your body is feeling, and the breath that's going in and out of your body. This is universally what we have. And that's what mindfulness is all about. It's not real complicated, it's not a lot of things. That's all I'm going to say about it right now. Peace, patience, persistence, and we'll see you as soon as possible.